Good evening. I'm McLean from the Library's Music Division. It's my great pleasure to introduce harpsichordist and organist John Butt, founder of this superb Dunedin Consort. Have I said it correctly? Yeah. Performing here tonight with soprano Meg Bragle and László Rózsa. Mr. Butt is Professor Butt is not only a distinguished performer, but a deeply respected figure in the world of Bach scholarship, the Gardner Professor of Music at the University of Glasgow, and the author of many influential books and articles on early music. So we're delighted to have you here with an all-Bach program, the first suite for orchestra, 2 cantatas, and 2 Brandenburg concertos. And I believe this is only your second appearance in the U.S., am I right?
This group, yes, it came. In fact, I was not the founder. It went for about 6 years before I came, and they did come once during that time, and then they came earlier this year to Boston, not with me. But so this is the first time I've been with them, although I've lived in the States myself for several years. So, but anyway, it's lovely to be here. So thank you very much.
I was curious about the name of the consort. Where does that come from?
Dunedin. Well, if you think of the word Edinburgh, Eden, ED is the same word. So Eden is the place name, and Dun means sort of fortification, which in depending whether you follow the Gaelic or the Old Scots is either borough, as in Edinburgh, or Dun, Eden. So it's the rock, in other words, for the Edinburgh Castle. Uh-huh. So it's based on the name of Edinburgh. It's the old name for Edinburgh, basically.
I wondered, we weren't sure how to pronounce it, so this is
Dun,
good.
as in Dun, Eden, yeah.
The consort is as you'll hear, one of the world's leading Baroque ensembles. It's known for elegant and wonderfully spontaneous and joyous performances. I know people often comment on how thoroughly grounded you all are in HIP, historically informed performance practice, and you've each done a remarkable body of research. And this was really borne out in your incredible recordings, like they have a recent recording of Handel's oratorio Samson. And yet you play with such a stunningly natural, free, joyous, buoyant approach. It's almost paradoxical a little bit. Of course, that's a goal, but not every ensemble reaches that goal.
Oh. So you think we should sound duller then?
Maybe,
Yes. Well, I mean, I think part of my research is not just knowing about the practices and the manuscripts or whatever, but also what the behaviours associated with this music were at the time and could still be associated. In other words, the relationship of the music both to emotional states, but also in terms of suspense and building up practice. In fact, László, he is just finishing a PhD on the whole concept of gesture in early Italian music. So he can tell you a little bit more if you wish.
Right, sure. So what is particularly fascinating about all of this is that all of the research and the looking into all these ideas actually enhance the performance in so much, and it actually furthers our imagination and the vigorousness of the performance, I would say. And for my part, what I've been working on is also very much this idea that we can actually very, very well connect back our current mindsets and ideas of today to back of the early 17th and late 16th century. So in this framework, we are not so far actually thought-wise as we would think, even if there are 300-400s apart. So actually, the continuity that we can see from there to today and how that can enhance our performance itself is a very important element.
And you've talked about multi-authorship, about working with people like these 2 colleagues you're sitting with, about the pleasure of learning sort of as you work through many pieces together. Each one has his own or her own expertise, and it's really remarkable. Have you worked with the ensemble very much before?
Actually. I was really lucky to live in the UK for a number of years, and when I lived in Scotland actually for a few months and was able to connect with John and the consort, and so we worked together many times. Been very lucky to...
In fact, you lived in Edinburgh, otherwise known as Dunedin.
I did in fact live in Edinburgh, and I was the loudest person there as a former New Yorker, very loud. But yes, I was very lucky to have that experience, especially coming from the States. You build on your experiences that way, and the sharing of ideas, and musical gestures, and it's wonderful. It's a joy.
You know, I'm very interested in hearing about your ambition to make early music relevant to today's music. And I had read Joe Buckley, that's your CEO, statement about saying that this was, she wanted to think that your patrons would hear early music as if it were contemporary, and this is part of your mission. So since you're starting with the Bach First Orchestra Suite, I wanted to ask you about your recent BBC Proms Programme, which featured all four.
All four, yes, yeah, of the Bach suites, yes. Well, there were several things we could have done with that, given that it was in the Albert Hall, which is not exactly a Baroque venue. So we first had to make the orchestra a lot bigger. But then I thought, if you have a lot of dance music in a row, even if it's by Bach, it does tend to sound the same after a while. So would it not be good to actually commission 4 new pieces that fitted into it didn't fit into the style, but took the idea of dance in a more contemporary idea. So that was one of my ideas. The idea we did was that. My other idea, of course, was to have people dancing, but the stage proved not to be big enough. But yes, commissioning 4 new pieces really was a joy for us because they really set off the 4 suites so well. And gave a lovely sort of trajectory, but also made the suite actually sound quite new in comparison. It's interesting how when you hear an unfamiliar piece of music that's just been written, then what was more or less familiar suddenly sounded new again. So that was one way, in other words, of revivifying earlier music.
And is commissioning a part of your work, your mandate?
Well, it has been in the past quite a lot, and it's becoming so again. So, yes, I think the idea of sort of new wine in old bottles, or is it old wine in new bottles? But anyway, you know what I mean. Using old instruments, because they do have their own affordances. They allow you to do certain things that modern instruments can't. They're much more restricted in many ways than modern instruments. There are only certain things you can do, but within that, you can often do things that you wouldn't otherwise hear. So yes, I think a lot of composers that I know now are getting increasingly interested in the sort of friction, the tone, just all sorts of things. Sometimes the tone is rougher, which you can make into an artistic idea. Sometimes it's thinner, but more direct. So there are all sorts of little nuances that different composers can actually hear as if they are discovering the violin or the oboe for the first time.
You know, this concept of mixing the Bach with the modern pieces is interesting to us, and we here at the library, we have a long tradition of commissioning and supporting new music and so on. We don't think of Bach as modern, and this is a topic that you've written so philosophically and remarkably on. I want to recommend this remarkable book, among others. I
didn't get past the 5th page myself. Anyway.
Yeah, but it's just so great, but maybe we can sort of wind along and thread that through as we talk. Just this concept of universality of Bach and what it means, how he was perceived in his day, how rhetoric was involved with how people perceived his music then. These kinds of questions.
Yes.
But yeah, maybe we should start looking at the cantatas. These are you'll be doing 2, which are both beautiful and very different.
Yeah. Well, yes, you start with the.
Well, this is the scholar. He should be talking about. They're both quite. They talk about the same thing. There's a lot of focus on sin. And how we should resist sin. And in one of the cantatas, the sin kind of sounds sort of fun, and in the other one, it's quite clear that we should avoid it at all costs. It's really thorny in the second cantata, on the second half of the program. The third movement is this really... I don't even know how to describe it. It's the organ does what feels like an obligato on its own entirely. The strings are doing something else, and then I'm singing this very sinuous, snake-like, maybe sort of devil. There's a lot of connections there.
In fact, it's one of Bach's ugliest pieces, I think, and it's so ugly. It's actually really beautiful.
It works as a result. Yeah, it is a very strange and difficult, but really cool piece. I'm not selling it very well, am I? No, it's fascinating.
I think delicious malevolence is what it's.
That's why, yeah. Delicious Malevolence is correct. And then the first piece is actually, tell me if I'm wrong, John, the first solo cantata that Bach wrote.
Well, the first one that survives, yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Widerstehe doch der Sünde, so resist, that's the resisting of sin. And it seems like we sort of start in the middle of something,
Yes,
don't we?
we do, yes,
on that one.
On a discord, yes.
Yeah, and it's very strong in the strings, jump, 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 but it still is kind of fun. Da, 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 da. And then I'm like, nope. Actually, no, we're going to, in fact, resist you. But it's going to be fun at the same time. So the interplay of the voice with the instruments is constantly, what's the word I want to say? Surprising, and also it doesn't let up. Bach doesn't give you a break, nor you either, but in a good way.
Yes, it's absolutely wonderful how that works in these pieces. And obviously he writes tempting music to show you what the sin is. He writes ugly music to show you how you should resist it and how sin can be ugly. And then he writes tempting music again to show you how well you feel once you've got rid of sin.
Right,
so,
exactly.
So in other words, he wins every way.
You want to talk for a moment about the text painting of certain words like sort of the grob and the schwert and so on?
Yes, we're going to say the Schwert.
I mean that in my humble opinion, Bach is all about text painting. And to your point about whether or not Bach is relevant to us today, if we're able to pay attention to the text, and I know there's if German isn't your first language, but even so, he sets things in such a way that you can hardly miss it, I think. So the opening of the first cantata, Widerstehe doch der Sünde, resist the sin. But now I've forgotten what I was going to, the greib, so we're grabbing, you have to resist it and grab it, and he really sets it. He goes, greib, doch der, I'm totally forgetting what I'm saying now. Don't mind me.
No,
John's going to save me now.
You've stuck very well to the script.
That's good. It's over here. And likewise, in the second cantata, the opening is so beautiful. That dum dum dum, da 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 dum dum. You really feel the beauty of the rest. That vergnügte Ruhe, and Ruhe is such an onomatopoetic word, where you feel rest. And he sets it beautifully. I mean, that's only one of 45 examples that John could do.
And part of the beauty of that rest is the actual musical rest. Da da da. Da, 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 da. So he actually uses space very well. In other words, Bach is a master of not writing music at times, which is very useful.
I want to ask you about the second aria, which I've read is one of the more peculiar ones, they say, in the output in terms of all the chromaticism, and something about the organ lines and the violin lines are almost swapped.
Yes, the violins become the bass, and the organ, which is meant to be played on two manuals, but I've only got one here, so my fingers get tangled, but I'll do what I can. So the organ, yes, the organ gives you the sort of snares of sin, I suppose, is what it's meant to show you.
Sinuous.
And then you're in the middle, and if you actually took out one or two moments of that piece, you'd think you were listening to Schoenberg or something. There's just moments when everything is clashing into everything else. It all sorts out in the end, as it always does. But if you just just homed in on one bar, you'd hear some wonderful dissonance.
I wanted to ask you all to talk about the Bach cantatas in terms of their dramatic impact on the listener. But we don't think of Bach writing opera, but I understand some of them were described as sacred operas, and you could actually buy a libretto a week in advance for some.
Yes, well, in fact, I think probably for most of them in Leipzig, at least, you could buy your libretto. The reason being because you could then study it. And it would also prepare you for the sermon, because Bach and the preachers were often in league that they would take a particular epistle or gospel text and work around it. And obviously the poetry is often quite graphic in Bach cantatas, and if you hear it straight off, you might not get what it's about. And also Bach's style is such that you might not necessarily hear the text. So they gave you a flying start. You'd buy the libretto, and you could study it and think about how it connected to the readings for the day. And then hopefully Bach's music would have its effect in terms of actually giving you an emotional connection to that text, and also the will to change, because I think that's one of the things that Lutheranism at this time really emphasizes. the idea of changing, constantly changing, renewing faith, turning away from sin. And so many of Bach's cantatas are couched as mini dramas in the head, in other words, in your head. Where you go from one state and you come out in another state. So that's one of the things that I would say is specifically modern about Bach's music, is that he has a very incisive awareness of psychology, and that's why I think they work also in a secular context, because you get the sense of how the mood is inflected and finally twisted and changed completely in the course of virtually every cantata that Bach wrote.
I've read that you have talked about them as a Lutheran meditation, that this is the purpose.
Yes. I mean, and meditation, not just in the sort of a mindfulness way of meditation, where you're in a sort of solitary state. It's a more directed meditation towards changing something, and it's there in the Lutheran tradition. It's there also in the Roman Catholic tradition, in the spiritual exercises, and so on. So it was very, very common in the 16th century as we went on. In fact, I'm sure László can tell us more about that.
About what exactly?
Exercises exercises to improve yourself.
Oh, right, yeah. Again, just turning back a little bit to an earlier part, what was particularly exciting in the 16th century and then continued into Bach's time as well, this whole idea of self-presentation being so central to one's, and exercising in how one comes across in every single day interaction, and how that seeps into the musical language as well. So that is something that was an extremely central idea to their daily thinking, daily life. Together to the extent that, for example, in Italy, in the 16th century, they had an enormous amount of behavioral manuals, and how one exactly actually practices these ideas of presentation, and how that then seeps into the musical language as a performer, how one then presents itself both on a gestural and on a mentality level, and that this is the sort of time that then sets up the tradition into which then Bach joins in.
Do you mean like stage deportment or more internal deportment?
It's a mixture, I would say. So it's in a sense there is a large amount of self-reflection and constant attention to the inner self of one's, and then of course the gestural and the behavioral manifestation of all of those practices that happen on the internal as well.
And so thinking about the way they would have been, these pieces, of course, were written for a religious context and perceived that way at the time, and now we almost perceive them without that many people hear them as secular pieces and so on. But you've talked about the quality of listening and the several different types of listening, and an interiorality of modern modes of perception. That's so interesting.
Yes, I mean, I think what we're both talking about here is a manifestation of what you might call the early modern mentality, which is building on one's personality both internally and externally, and so that the outside matches the inside, and the inside is honed, whether spiritually or socially. And that's, again, why I think the mechanism is the same, whether you're talking about a secular instance or a sacred, and the two work together, which I think is precisely why Bach's music works so well outside the very specific denomination in which he worked.
And just the addition that from the perceivers, and of course there is also that sort of performance of the intake of the music. So there is a continuous duality of both the one who plays and the one on the receiver, and also would be practicing the perception of the music in this sense.
And I know Bach had a commentary, Abraham Kaloff, about many things, but one of the things that you've written about was his vocation, his idea of his vocation as a composer, if you could speak to that.
Well, this is a very interesting issue, because in this sense, Bach is quite archaic. He feels that we are all born into a particular profession and born into a particular social status, and that's your lot, basically, and God has chosen that, but you have to, and his status was as a musician. So that, so far, so medieval, but then, of course, he makes the whole concept of composer such a thick concept that it never really been before. I think Bach, in a certain sense, is very much part of the inventive strategy that makes the mythology of the modern composer as somebody who has an absolutely outstanding insight into musical material, but also is able to combine that with social and personal observation. I mean, I suppose the key figure here is Beethoven, but I think it's Bach is very much in line with that particular trajectory in the early 18th century, and that's exactly why I think Bach suddenly became such a famous composer just after the death of Beethoven, when Mendelssohn brought his music back into the concert hall, and it's almost as if people knew him already because they will have heard that sort of, I would say, digestion of musical ideas, techniques, gestures, and counterpointing them all together. They'd have heard that already through Mozart and through Beethoven, and Haydn for that matter as well.
With this concept of the universality of Bach, what about other cultures? What do you hear about when you perform internationally?
Well, this is an interesting question, because as an academic, I would say very strictly that Bach is not universal, because he's very specific, I would say, to the Western tradition, what most of us belong to. And therefore, from that point of view, you have to see him as universal within that particular long tradition. But it's not to say, though, that there are not other countries that can go through similar processes. And we see this, I think, in the Far East in particular, where they've modernized their industries, they've modernized their ways of life, their democracy has come in certain countries, and so on. So if you think of Japan, Korea, and so on, it's very interesting to see not only have they adopted some of the things that Western modernity was already doing, and often even better in a certain sense, but they've also developed the same tastes, and it's almost as if they've gone through the 500 years that Western modernity has gone through in 50, 60, 70 years, or 100 years perhaps in the case of parts of China. And it's so interesting to see that Bach and composers like him become absolutely central. And in fact, one of the greatest performance groups in Bach in the world is in Japan. Really absolutely outstanding. Yes, I mean, I would say, it's probably one of the top 2 or 3.
We've had them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely excellent. So it's very interesting then to see that what I would call this, if you're interested in sort of the academic side of things, I would say this is a concept of multiple modernities. In other words, the process of modernity, which the West in many ways was first with, but not necessarily in every way, is replicable and adaptable to many different cultures across the world. And I suppose it's one of our huge debates right now is whether we're leaving modernity, whether there's something better around the corner, or whether it's being flushed down into the sewage. So it's an interesting question. But anyway, that's a long way.
Well, I want to come back to that actually, but for now I was thinking, let's talk a bit about the manuscript study and the way that the sources inform what you will all be doing tonight. And I was going to say that all three of you are certainly some of the people on the earth who've looked most closely at the largest number of Bach sources. And I wanted to ask you to talk about things like ornamentation and so on. But first, I was going to say that we have a rare treat in that we are going to put on display tonight for about an hour one of our Bach cantata manuscripts. And so that's why the big light is set up in the foyer here. And it'll be, just a very short time. It has to go back to the vaults and so on. But in terms of you're looking at manuscripts like this one, would you have comments to say about what the manuscripts tell us about Bach the composer? First, not about the particularities, but about what you perceive about him as a person. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is an interesting issue because Bach's hand changes according to whether he's copying, whether he's making a dedication copy to give to somebody, or whether he's actually composing. Having said that, he finds it very hard to copy anything without recomposing, without improving. But anyway, his hand is very different, and it's much less tidy, obviously, when he's actually composing, and the notes, they're not quite so well positioned. But what is hugely interesting, I think, if you see a composing score of Bach, and yours might actually have some, I think from what I remember, it does have some composing material in it, you can tell from the first section of any piece he's writing, whether it's instrumental or vocal, the so-called ritornello, the introduction, I suppose, is the simple way of putting it, that's where the composition really takes place, where all the crossings out, where the trial and error, you can see him trying this, trying that, trying that. And what he's essentially doing is putting together a reservoir of ideas, what rhetoricians would call the invention, a sort of the topic of the piece. And that then, once you get to the vocal part, he writes almost at the speed at which he can improvise or sing it. And there's very few crossings out. It's almost as if once he's got the reservoir, the material in place, the piece then writes itself almost.
And one of our manuscripts that shows how at the bottom of the page he's thinking, and he's writing a bit of like an incipit or something that is telling him what to do next, little notes to himself, but while the ink is drying, you can see that.
Well, yes, and he was fortunate to have been brought up in a slightly archaic method of playing the organ, which is called German organ tablature, where you actually use letter names as a way of indicating the notes and with lines to show which octave it's in. And when his invention, as it were, is spilling over and he hasn't yet ruled the next page, to stop, so he catches it, he does it in these very small letters at the bottom of the page, because it's more efficient than stave notation, or harder to read. But so it's very interesting. He's very lucky to have that. It's like a shorthand typist who writes notes very, very quickly, but is generally illegible, but to themselves is legible.
You know, I know that the Brandenburg Concerto manuscripts were supposed to be very beautiful compared to some of the other manuscripts because they were a presentation copy. And we can talk, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the performance practice of the concertos, but before we leave this comment, I was just thinking, you've described Bach as being a very sensual composer, and I was wondering how you reflect on this in terms of the personality behind the music.
Well, I think it seems to me that Bach had many experiences, although if you look at him in comparison to most other big composers of the time, his purview was relatively narrow. He didn't travel a huge amount, not as much as Handel, for instance, but it seems to be very clear that he was very observant and felt very deeply what was going on around him. I don't think it's the case that, you know, the cat dies, he writes a miserable cantata, but the fact that well, he'd lost many children over the years, it builds into the armoury of what he does. It builds into his store of musical ideas, store of expressive devices. So I think he's somebody who capitalizes on every experience. And I suspect there's a sort of religious motivation to that you know, he thinks that what God throws my way, I have to make the most of, regardless of whether it's good or bad. And this, of course, is very much part of the metaphysics of the time. You think of Leibniz, who says that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Even if your roof falls down, it's still to the best eventually. I don't know how, but it's all calculated by God so that at the end of time, your roof falling down was a fantastic thing to have happened.
The book, Bach's Dialogue with Modernity, you have to read this book. I really recommend it. We can talk more about that. About the Brandenburgs, I'd love to hear from all of you about how you perform them, what temperaments, what tuning. I know this affects dramatically what the audience will hear.
I think László would like to talk about the recorder here, because...
I'm dying. Yeah, the recorder. Well, so I think that just to answer your question first, the temperament, I believe it's Bach Barnes is what we will be playing at. We are on 415, so on so-called Baroque pitch, so a bit lower than the modern 440, 442. And in terms of, let's start then with number 4, which has 2 recorders in it, and an extremely virtuosic violin part. So it's the dialogue between those 3 concerting instruments. What's very interesting from a recorder point of view, that Bach titles the instruments involved there as flauti di echo.
Yes. That's rare to see that.
I mean, it's so rare that I don't think that it ever happened anywhere
existed,
else. Yeah. And it's still a bit questionable as far as I know what exactly that meant. There are all sorts of speculations. If you want to look up, there are versions where someone have built copies of instruments actually, which are working as like double recorders, as echo instruments, and then whenever, especially in the second movement, when you will hear there are parts which are sort of repeating itself and are genuinely sounding like echoes. And some have speculated that those would be played on those sort of double instruments, and then
So
there is one loud, one quiet, and there is one back and forth. It's quite entertaining to see how people jump back and forth between the instruments. And there is another speculation, which is, I think, a little bit more plausible as an idea, is that the second movement was actually performed at another part of the church, as essentially as echoing the orchestral part and the violin. So, and actually the third movement very interestingly corresponds to this theory, because there is exactly enough time for the recorder players when their entry comes to return to the beginning from the upper part of the church. So this is another theory. So it's a wonderful piece altogether, with the extremely virtuosic violin bit, which you will hear later, performed by Cecilia, really, really fantastically. And yeah.
And do you use the 392 for the cantata?
Well, not today. We have done, yes. I mean, we in Curtin, where Bach composed the Brandenburg concertos, well, he used two pitches. He used one very high pitch for church music. Not that he did much there, but for court music, it was at the low French pitch, which is actually a semitone lower still, so a tone below modern pitch. But in Leipzig, he tended to go to the semitone below, to the 415. So, yes, so if we were doing it in the Curtin version, the original version, in other words, we would indeed do 392. But in fact, one of the cantatas we're doing today was meant to be at high pitch, so in fact, we've transposed it high, the first one, because it, yes. You've done it at both pitches, haven't you?
Yes. The lower, the E flat, is so low, can't imagine who is singing it. That's a whole nother can of worms, which we don't have to open up. Countertenor, won't go there. But it does open up a can of worms because it's so low. I mean, it's really at the outer range of that type of voice. But luckily, we're doing it in F, which corresponds to, as John was saying, the pitch.
The sounding pitch, at least. Yes, not the written pitch, but the sounding pitch. Yeah.
Which makes it considerably easier, for me anyway. Hopefully the orchestra doesn't mind.
No, not at all.
Well, back to this, when I find myself back at this thing about the historically informed performance music movement, talking about in the context of populist, nationalist, climate change even. These are things that you've talked about, and it seems a little odd to go there, but it would be fascinating to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I suppose one of the things that historical performance does, particularly in terms of instruments, is that it suggests that one aspect of modernity is to make everything much smoother and easier. Rationalization of industry, for instance, division of labor, by which one man puts on the wheels, another one puts on the roof, and so on. But what this does is returns you a little bit to the craft-like mentality of earlier ages, by which each person is, in a certain sense, responsible for the entire performance, or László would make his own recorders, as he does on a daily basis. Obviously. Yeah. But I mean, oboists make their reeds. Sometimes, quite often, everybody has a knowledge of the history of their instrument and of some of the context around it, and that's, I think, one of the things that early historical performance musicians tend to bring with them, is this broader sense that they need to know a little bit about everything in connection with the performance in order to understand what their role in the whole is. So I think that is quite a useful way of making us think a little bit more about those aspects of modern life that we perhaps take too much for granted and that are too streamlined, and that this gets us back a little bit to working on taking responsibility, I suppose, that's what it is. It's taking responsibility for more aspects of the overall production. So yes, that's a sort of, in a certain sense, an anti-modern thought, but it is part of the process nonetheless.
It's fascinating to think about these kinds of larger issues, and we often don't get to them. We're looking at more tinier questions, but thank you for that. I think maybe people here might have a lot of questions they might like to ask, but what do you think? Are you guys armed with questions?
Thank you. Look forward to the concert and also to listening to your Samson. I haven't heard your Samson. Here's kind of a left field question for you that I just thought up. Bach wrote oratorios, which were cycles of cantatas, and he wrote passions, which he started in mid-career or early career and then revised later. What was, did Bach, and also Bach was always looking at Dresden. He somewhat aspired to move up to Dresden, and he conceived his B minor Mass for the court Catholic church in Dresden. Did Bach know about what Handel was doing with the oratorio form early, and then from mid-London career on? Is there anything in his that he was aware? Did he have any relationship to either the Catholic oratorio or the London oratorio of Handel? Thank you.
This is a hugely interesting question. The answer is yes, in many respects. I'm not sure that he necessarily knew Handel's oratorios because they came quite late in his career, but some of the earlier pieces, we actually have more and more evidence that he performed Handel. There was the Armida cantata he performed from Handel's early period. He performed at the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig, and he performed several other pieces of Handel as well. And he also copied the Broca's Passion of Handel before he wrote the two major ones. He might have written the previous Passion. So he's very, very much interested in Handel. And in fact, I think it's quite interesting to think that Bach was more interested in Handel than Handel was interested in Bach. Handel showed no interest in meeting Bach. He avoided a meeting once. They came from a similar part of Germany. No interest whatever. I mean, he might have had interest, but there's no evidence of interest. But there is a lot of evidence that Bach, I think he had a sort of encyclopedic sort of mind. He liked to collect things. So I think he certainly understood the dramaturgy of Handel to a certain extent, how Handel played out pieces in cantatas and in passions. So I think he learned something from that. Regarding Dresden, of course, we do know that Bach went to opera performances there, particularly by Hasse. Yeah, exactly. So he would have known opera there. Whether he saw oratorios, I don't know, but he certainly knew the masses, because I've looked at some of the Selenka masses that were done in Dresden, and I'm pretty sure I've spotted a few little turns of phrase that Bach was later to use, particularly in the B minor Mass. So yes, I think Bach was an omnivore, to be honest. Handel too, but Handel had a very specific form of source that he liked to copy. Quite often keyboard music, quite often the generation before him, and he liked to sort of update it in a way. He had a very specific strategy for composing. There was another one over there, I think, second. And then three. 2, 3.
If I'm not mistaken, you tend to fall on the one voice per part side of the, I guess, is it still a controversy or something? Are you kind of dogmatic about it, or do you think it's more on a case-by-case basis?
Well, actually, when one becomes very dogmatic about this, which people can be, the result of being dogmatic is catatonic. That really does send you off. No, I'm not at all dogmatic about this. What I am slightly dogmatic about is the notion that the soloists, what we call the soloists, are the leaders of the chorus. So it's a secondary issue as to whether they were doubled or not by other people. It's the question that the choruses are made up of solo lines and are therefore sung by people as if they were soloists. So, for instance, in our Samson recording, we record it twice. Once in a version that Handel did in the early performances when he didn't have the larger choir, and it was just the 8 soloists, so it's 2 to a part for most of it, although some of it's double choir. And then we recorded it again with Handel's main size of chorus, which was, well, it should have been about 25. We were a little bigger than that because we weren't sure how it was going to turn out. But basically doubling the soloists with extra singers, and specifically doubling the soprano soloists, of which there are 3 in Samson, with boys. So that's quite a big choir, but it's the same principle, using the soloists as the core of the chorus. So that's what's important to me. Sometimes in a small building, one might use single voices, and it's quite clear that Bach often did that. But I think it's I think they are smaller choirs than we would like to think. But if you go to many of those German churches in Eastern Germany, it's remarkable how they have focal points in the organ loft and elsewhere, where just a small number of singers can sound extremely strong. So it's not so much an issue when you actually go to the buildings, perhaps anyway.
Now that we're at the eve of official Brexit, I'm just wondering how might that affect performing artists in the UK, and whether any musicians in the UK might be tempted to leave, and as some academics and researchers seem to want.
Well, this is an interesting question indeed. I mean, there's several issues. One is, of course, the problem of touring. Dunedin Consort does quite a lot of touring, and whether that will dry up. And indeed, some of our European touring has gone down in the last year or so, and we're wondering whether that will pick up again. So there's that question of just the sheer issue of getting there. There's also the concept of just-in-time, which you might have heard of in relation to the British car industry, by which different components go across the English Channel and back several times before the car is actually built, because it's unbelievably the most efficient way of doing it. And if you put blocks in the way of that just-in-time, obviously the industry becomes unviable. But it's exactly the same with singers and players, particularly at the high freelance level, because they have to quite often, I have somebody who sings with me on Monday and Tuesday, then goes to Salzburg to sing Wednesday and Thursday to finish off another job, and then comes and does the concert with me Thursday, Friday, and so on. And they can only make a living that way by the constant travelling between the countries. And the trouble where I live in Scotland, in fact, we too live, and László does a huge amount of work around about. If it becomes difficult for László to do work elsewhere outside Scotland, there is simply not enough work in Scotland to keep him going, unless he does other things. But as a top-level performer, you need to be performing all the time, and you need. So that's just an example of possible problems. But László will tell you more, as always.
I think we are just hoping for the best at this point, really. That as daunting it sounds at the moment, that will not be the case at the end, and that also I think with the Scottish independence, how that will turn out, and that whole idea comes up, and whether that's so it's everything seems to be very much as it sounds in the news, completely in the dark, and I think that's how we all feel, and that makes the biggest uncertainty and the biggest anxiety to a certain extent as well in all the performers, I think, involved in this.
Could you explain whether and how Bach used a keyboard in his compositions?
You mean in order to do the composing?
Yes.
Or did he use the keyboard to compose with?
Anything like Mozart or Chopin?
Well, I think what Bach did, he was trained as an absolutely excellent improviser, and he always, one thing he did say that's quite interesting is that he didn't like to sit at the keyboard without music. He liked to see some music, often by somebody else, to give him an idea, and then he would play and make something up and improvise. And he could improvise for hours. He could improvise an entire recital if he wished to. So that's, I think, where the keyboard is involved in his compositional process. And then when he's at his desk, I don't think he needs the keyboard because he's got it all in his head. But it's definitely through the keyboard and through his knowledge of singing, which he'd had from a young age, and string playing, which we know he did. And he probably could reasonably make noises on wind instruments as well. So because he came from a sort of Stadtpfeifer background, partly anyway. So I suspect his actual composition he wasn't referring to the keyboard. But certainly the keyboard is very much part of his learning process. Yeah.
I presume you're familiar with the Bach Museum in Leipzig. Has that figured any way in your researches? Because the new and expanded museum employs a lot of new technology, which really answers a lot of questions about what part of Bach's pieces were actually composed by Bach, when were changes made, and who actually made the changes. They can tell the hands of the people who were doing the the writing
Oh,
in the manuscripts and so forth. And it sounds like you are concerned about details, and that's why I asked the
I mean,
question.
study of Bach's hand in Leipzig and originally in Göttingen when the two Germans were split, they basically, developed the entire form of modern Bach scholarship from the 1950s onwards through meticulous development of handwriting identification. So there's a 60-year-old tradition now lying behind that. But as you said, what's been added now are more spectrographic and
Right, digital applications.
Things, yeah. Occasionally the digital applications throw up odd results which cannot be true for various reasons, but there's been some controversy over that in certain cases. But it's certainly the overall direction is towards very, very close understanding of every blot. And this is something which, as I say, it hasn't just suddenly happened. It's a long, long process that's been going on. And certainly anybody who does manuscript study of Bach will always start with the German research that was done mainly in the 1950s, but then subsequently, not just of Bach's hand, but everybody else's as well.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else for a moment? No? Well, I really, one more? Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So how is singing Bach different from singing other composers?
Good question. It's completely different. Bach essentially expects you to function without breathing. At all times. When I was a young singer first singing Bach, I thought, oh my God, really, when am I going to breathe? There is no time. I've gotten over that. But yes, it's continuous. That part is quite different, say, from Handel, who is really quite singer-friendly. You get a phrase, you breathe, you go on. It's really clear. The line is more lyrical, if you will. I'm putting that in big air quotes, which isn't to say that Bach doesn't write lyrically for the voice. Of course he does, right? The Agnus Dei being a beautiful example in my own voice part. But I think the difference is kind of mental in a way, really. It's attention to the very specific details of the language, and working with John and the Dunedin is a great way to keep it at the forefront. You know, I feel pretty decent about my Bach experience, and there's always something that you can do more. Neid und Hass, like really get into the ha between that, before the H. I'm making a bit of a micro point here, but you wouldn't necessarily spend the time on that in some of the other composers. You want to get onto the main point, but actually talking about text painting, that it's so very important to have the text come forth in Bach, because it was everything. I mean, that was the point from which that was where he started, right? I mean, not the scholar here, but that would be where he started from. So the difference in singing it means that you're really breaking things down in multiple layers and then trying to keep the overarching lyricism as well. Whereas if you're singing Mozart, good Lord, it's all about line. Just line, 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 line. Of course the text is important, I'm not diminishing that, but the line, he could, I mean, think of the Et Incarnatus Est, for example, from the C minor Mass. I mean, that's just, it almost doesn't matter what you're saying, because you get that that's going to be, whereas Bach would say, Agnus Dei qui tot, like he really gives you the opportunity to make the text important, even within this longer line. So, although it starts out, particularly perhaps as a younger singer, I'm just speaking from my own experience, is more of a challenge to overcome maybe one's concept of singing as, you know, beautifully shaped pearls of sound continuously drawn out. In the end, I think you find that the lyricism is still there. There's just a lot of other things that must not be missed. Hope that answers.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank the Dunedin Consort. We're so excited to have you, Meg Bragle, John Butt, László Rózsa.